Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the premiere of the Infinite Dial Canada 2018. This is the first inaugural edition that was redundant and repetitive of the Infinite Dial, which obviously is a survey that we have done for many, many years in the United States with our partners at Triton Digital, but this is the first time that we're bringing it to Canada. And we're super excited to do this. First of all, let me answer the first two questions about webinars that are possibly the most popular questions in webinar history. Number one, the presentation will be available on our website and at Triton Digital. And second, we'll be taking questions both on the GoToWebinar interface, but we'll also be on Twitter. And we ask that you use the hashtag InfiniteDial. And I'll be on Twitter. I'll be a little busy for the next 40 minutes or so, but after this is over, I'll be on Twitter hanging out and taking your questions. So you can either ask here in the interface or you can ask on Twitter. And again, please use the hashtag InfiniteDial. So I'm personally very excited to be bringing the Infinite Dial to Canada because although I was born and raised south of your border, I was in fact born and raised right on the Canadian border. In fact, right where Maine meets New Brunswick is where I grew up. So while my American friends were listening to or watching US cop shows and things like that, I was raised on a steady diet of the Beachcombers and Rene Simard, which is probably why I grew up to be such a nice young man. So I'm thrilled to be bringing you all of this great data about Canada's media consumption and technology. We're going to talk about streaming audio. We're going to talk about podcasting. And what we've done here is essentially mirroring the methodology and the techniques that we use for the Infinite Dial US, which we have run continuously since 1998. It's the longest running study of media and technology in America. And it covers a wide range of online and digital media topics. And what we've done here is mirrored the methodology that we use in the United States. And we're going to have some interesting comparisons and contrasts between the two countries. But just very quickly about the methodology, this is a telephone study of 1,000 people ages 18 and up. And we use a random digit dialing methodology to ensure that this is projectable and representative of the Canadian population 18 and up. And that includes a sufficient proportion of mobile-only cell phone interviews to be able to mirror the population of Canada that is cell phone only. And we offer this survey in both English and French, and it's been weighted to the national 18 plus population figure. So it is as representative and projectable as we can make it. I'll add one quick note here. The Infinite Dial US is 12 plus. In Canada, it is 18 plus due to some of the legal requirements of doing research in Canada. So there may be a couple of differences here and there that are explainable perhaps by that age difference, but for the most part, things mirror very, very closely. So I'm going to start with a look at media and technology in general. And the best place to start there is with a look at the various devices that we use to get online and to consume media. 76% of Canadians 18 plus own a smartphone. 54% have some kind of internet connected TV, and that can happen through a variety of means. Through the television itself might have that ability natively, or perhaps some kind of a set-top box or even a gaming console. And then about half of Canadians 18 plus have a tablet. And so I'm going to break these numbers down a little bit. First of all, in terms of smartphone ownership, again, about 3/4 of Canadians own a smartphone, but look at 18 to 34, 97%. And this really, I think, speaks to not just having a mobile first strategy, but even a mobile only strategy to reach that age group. 35 to 54 also extremely high at 86%, and a little over half of 55 plus owns a smartphone. How that compares with the United States? Essentially, it mirrors what the United States looked like about a year and a half ago. So it's just a tiny bit behind smartphone ownership in the US, which currently is at 82%. And again, in Canada, 76% 18 plus. Tablet ownership, as I mentioned, about half of 18 and older Canadians own a tablet, and that's really weighted 35 to 54. The 18 to 34 crowd very much on smartphones and phablets, as they are called, but 35 to 54 much more likely to own a tablet. And another way that we are accessing the internet and accessing media in various ways in both the United States and in Canada are with smart speakers. And we've talked an awful lot about smart speakers in our work with Triton and also in our work with NPR on the Smart Audio Report. And currently, in terms of awareness, 54% of Canadians 18 plus are aware of Google Home, and 46% are aware of the Amazon Alexa suite of products. And that's very simply down to the fact that Amazon Alexa really wasn't introduced until late last year, just before the holiday season in Canada. So Google had a head start, and we're going to see the ramifications of that head start here in the next couple of graphs. Comparing this to the United States, first of all, you can see that Alexa, the Amazon Alexa suite of products, have much higher awareness in the United States, 70% in the US infinite dial study, compared to 46% in the Canadian infinite dial study, while Google Home essentially is the same in both countries. So again, that head start you can see from Google, I have no doubt that Amazon will catch up given the amount of media and the amount of advertising that they're placing behind these products. Currently, 8% of Canadians 18 and over own some kind of smart speaker. And we've shown you this here, 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. These devices are getting into the hands of older Americans and older Canadians for a variety of reasons. But right now, you're more likely to own one if you're 18 to 54. So 8% is the total penetration in Canada for these devices. And to compare that with the United States, it's essentially where the US was exactly a year ago. 1 year ago in the Infinite Dial 2017, we showed that 7% of Americans owned a smart speaker. Today, that's 17%. So that number has accelerated dramatically, and it's certainly accelerated dramatically as a result of the increased distribution of these devices. The Amazon series of products are available in the US at Whole Foods supermarkets, and both companies have very inexpensive offerings. And I fully expect that the Canadian number is going to look very similar to this year's US number next year. Now, I mentioned that Google had a head start, and you can see the ramifications of that right here. If you own a smart speaker, 63% of Canadians who own a smart speaker have a Google Home device, but not an Amazon Alexa device. And that's really the mirror image of what these numbers are in the United States. 30% have an Alexa device, but not a Google Home, and 7% own both. And again, this pie chart looks almost identical to the one in the US, with the exception of Alexa being the larger component here as opposed to Google Home. So that head start has had certainly big ramifications for Google. We're going to see Google have some fairly impressive showings elsewhere in the study. Google certainly has a deep footprint in Canada, and that's very much in evidence here with smart speakers. We asked a question that we also asked in the American Infinite Dial study: how many radios do you own in your home? Now, again, this is not radios owned overall because people have them in their cars, but how many do you own in your home? 29% of Canadians say they don't have a radio in their home, and the mean number of radios that they have in their home is 1.6. And as we did in the US study, we broke this down demographically. If you're 18 to 34, there's a 51% chance you don't have a radio in your home. Now, that doesn't mean you can't access radio content, certainly through your smartphone, through your television set even, and also through smart speakers. But as we saw in the US, about half of the younger demographic do not have a radio in their home. And in fact, the American number and the Canadian number here are almost identical. 29% in both countries say they don't have a radio, and the mean number of radios in the home in Canada, it's 1.6. In the US, it's 1.7. So very, very similar numbers here, very, very close in terms of radio ownership in the home. So I'm going to move now to talk a little bit about online audio. I want to acknowledge that Western Media Group in Vancouver is having a listening party, which is apparently a thing. So cheers, drink a shot for me. In terms of online audio, 57% of Canadians 18 plus say they listened to some kind of online audio in the last month. And that could be the streams of AM/FM radio, that could be online only content that's available over the internet. But 57% of Canadians 18 plus have consumed some kind of online audio in the last month. It's about 3/4 of 18 to 34-year-olds, 63% of 35 to 54-year-olds, and 41% of 55 plus, which is still a fairly high number. Compare that to the United States, and again, it really looks like the United States looked back in 2016. Today, 61% of Americans 12 plus have listened to some kind of online audio in the last month, and that compares to 57% of Canadians. So very, very close here. In terms of weekly online listening, it's 49% have listened sometime in the last week to online audio, and that's fairly close to the monthly number, which means it's pretty high conversion here. A very high percentage of people that are sampling online audio are in fact making it a habit at about half of Canadians 18 plus. 64% of 18 to 34-year-olds have listened to online audio in the last week, and 55% of 35 to 54-year-olds have listened to online audio. So again, these are fairly high numbers, fairly high conversion from the monthly numbers. And again, to compare this to the United States, very, very similar to the monthly numbers. It looks fairly similar to the United States about 2 years ago. Today, 55% of Americans 12 plus have listened to some kind of online audio in the last week, and 49% again of Canadians have listened to online audio in the last week. So very, very close numbers here. So I'm going to talk about some audio brands here, some of the specific brands that are leading in online audio in Canada. One very big difference between the American infinite dial and the Canadian infinite dial is there's no Pandora in Canada, at least not legally. I know who you are out there. But we're going to talk about the brands that are leading in Canada and the consumption of those brands. And we'll start here with a look at audio brand awareness. Spotify is the brand that leads in terms of audio awareness, brand awareness, but it's very closely followed by Apple Music, the Apple Music subscription product, and Google Play Music. Google Play Music here in a strong number 3. Again, Google does seem to have a bit of a larger footprint in terms of the Canadian data that we see compared to the American data that we revealed in last month's Infinite Dial webinar. iHeartRadio and Amazon really tied here for 4th and 5th, followed by SoundCloud, CBC Music, Stingray at 33%, and Yahoo at 23%, and then you'll see some others on the right-hand side. And I'll ask you to remember that Stingray number at 33%, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Now, in terms of how that compares to the American Infinite Dial, Spotify, very, very similar, almost identical awareness in the two countries, 64% compared to 62%. Apple Music, just a little bit more familiarity in Canada. Google Play Music, however, has a significant bump in Canada, again, really continuing that theme of the footprint that Google occupies in the Canadian media landscape. But then you see iHeartRadio significantly stronger in America in terms of awareness. Amazon Music, which I think that's going to grow if it mirrors what we've seen in the American data based upon Alexa usage and Alexa uptake. We see twice as many people who have a smart speaker say that Amazon Music is the service they use the most in America. And if Alexa continues to broaden its footprint in Canada, I would expect to see Amazon Music grow. And then you see SoundCloud. And obviously, there are some brands that are in Canada, but really not in play in the United States, which we don't show here because we don't have American data. Now, here's a very interesting graph. We asked people, not awareness, but have you listened to these services in the last month? Now, Spotify, as you might have guessed, is number 1. 19% of Canadians 18 plus say that they have listened to Spotify in the last month. But number 2 is Montreal's own Stingray. And that was not number 2 in terms of awareness. So I think what that tells you is that Stingray punches way above its weight in terms of awareness, trial, and usage, as it is number 2 here in our graph. Apple Music and Google Play are tied for 3rd at 11%, followed by SoundCloud, CBC Music, and TuneIn. And again, just to show you a comparison with the American Infinite Dial data, Spotify, very close, 19% monthly in Canada and 17% in the United States, which I think you see some of these brands soaking up some of the listening that Pandora would occupy here in the United States. Apple Music nearly tied. Google Play Music nearly double in terms of monthly online listening in Canada compared to what it is in the United States. SoundCloud is very close, and certainly iHeart leads much more strongly in the United States. Now, a quick look at weekly online audio listening. Spotify, again, continues to be number 1. That's 16%, very close to the 19% monthly. So again, strong conversion here from awareness and trial to regular usage. Number 2 is Apple Music at 9%, and then Stingray and Google Play are tied for 3rd at 7%. So very different landscape in Canada compared to the United States in terms of the leading brands. Compare weekly audio listening between the United States and Canada again. Spotify, a little bit of a bump in Canada at 16% compared to 14% in the United States. Apple Music, really a tie. Again, Google Play Music nearly double what it is in the United States, and SoundCloud a little bit stronger in the United States. We asked people, what's the audio brand that you use most often? And a couple of things about this graph. First of all, unsurprisingly, Spotify is #1 here, but it's not the majority. And in fact, it's not even what I would call a strong plurality. It's 26% of Canadians who use an online audio brand say Spotify is the brand they use most often. But we see Apple Music at 16%, and then Google Play and Stingray tied at 14%. So there's definitely a lot of brand affinity here for the local product with Stingray, and certainly Google Play punches above its American weight in Canada. And just to compare the audio brand used most often in Canada versus the United States, you'll see a significant difference here between how Spotify looks. Spotify is much stronger in Canada, but you can't ignore the central part of that United States bar. 37% say Pandora. Again, there's no Pandora in Canada, but we see a number of other brands kind of picking up that slack, including Stingray, Google Play, which is significantly larger in Canada for this question, and Apple Music. And finally, we would be remiss in this section not to talk about YouTube music usage, which is actually ahead of what it is in the United States. For people who say they've used YouTube to watch music videos or listen to music in the last week, 46% of Canadians 18 plus say they have done that, compared to 44% in the United States. And I have to believe that there's a significant portion of that that is actually being done on desktops and laptops where people are connected to Wi-Fi. And I'll give you a hint of why I believe that here in a little bit. We'll move on now to in-car audio. There's a few interesting differences here between the United States and Canada in terms of in-car audio. First of all, we asked people, do you currently ever use these audio sources in your car? And the top 3 here really do look a lot like, actually the top 4 look a lot like the graph in the infinite dial United States. 83% of Canadians 18 plus who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month, which is 83% of them, say that AM/FM radio is used in their car. 49% say they use a CD player. 40% their own digital music, MP3 files, files from iTunes, Google Play, etc. 22% say podcasts, and 12% say satellite radio, and 11% online radio. And just as we saw in the US infinite dial, podcasts have surged up ahead of satellite radio and online radio. And there's probably a pretty good reason for that. First of all, satellite radio not as big in Canada as it is in the United States. You can see that here, 21% of Americans who have driven or ridden in a car say they've listened to satellite radio, compared to 12% of Canadians. And online radio, significantly larger in the US right now. And I have to believe that that is related to the difference in data plans, in mobile data plans between the United States and Canada. And I'll have a little bit more evidence of that a little bit later on. And I think as unlimited data plans, if and when they become popular and inexpensive, let's say, in Canada, I predict that we'll see those numbers go up quite a bit. But podcasts look very similar to the United States. Owned digital music, CD player, and AM/FM radio, very, very similar to the data that we have for the United States. We asked people, what's the audio source you use most often in your car? And again, I do tie this graph somewhat to the difference in unlimited data plans, in mobile data plans between the United States and Canada. AM/FM radio is higher in Canada. 63% of Canadian drivers or riders say that AM/FM is what they use the most, compared to 56% in the United States. Couple of the biggest differences here are certainly satellite radio, much bigger in the US, but CDs and your own music, much higher in Canada right now, 22% compared to 15%. So all you folks riding around listening to those Kim Mitchell and April Wine CDs, rock on. And a part of that, and a part of those numbers and the differences between the US and Canada, is the lower penetration really of in-dash information and entertainment systems in Canada. While 15% of 18 and up drivers and riders in the US say they have some kind of built-in in-dash information and entertainment system, that number is 10% in Canada. It's quite a bit smaller. And again, I have to believe that's tied to the difference in mobile data plans. So let's move on to podcasting and some super interesting data here in terms of podcasting in Canada. First of all, as we do in the United States, we ask people, are you familiar with the term podcasting? 61% of Canadians say that they're familiar with that term. That's 63% of 18 to 34s and 70% of 35 to 54s. But even 55 plus is about half of the country. And as I mentioned on the Infinite Dial US webinar, I want to clarify this question. This question does not mean that people know what podcasting is. It just means that they've heard of the term. And I can assure you that there are people out there that have heard of the term that have a fundamental misunderstanding about what podcasting is, how they can listen to them, and whether or not they would even want to. But at least familiarity with the term here is 61% of the country. And compared to the United States, that's a little ahead of where the US was last year and a little behind where the US is this year. This year, United States familiarity is 64%, again, compared to 61% in Canada. Now, in terms of listening, 28% of Canadians 18 and up have listened to a podcast in the last month. That's 41% of 18 to 34-year-olds. That's getting to be a pretty high number. 29% 35 to 54 and 19% 55 plus. So that 28% definitely shows that podcasting is getting to be quite strong in Canada. You can compare that to the US data here. In the United States, it's 25% have listened to a podcast in the last month, 28% in Canada. And again, this particular question might be a little bit of an artifact of the fact that our Canadian data is 18 plus while our US data is 12 plus, since podcasting is a little bit stronger 18 and up compared to 12 to 17. For demographics, we can see here that 31% of Canadian men 18 and up have listened to a podcast in the last month, and 26% of Canadian women. So both numbers over a quarter, both numbers fairly strong, especially when you compare them to the United States numbers. Weekly podcast listening now is 19% of Canadians 18 plus. So nearly 1 in 5 Canadians 18 plus have listened to a podcast in the last week. That's led by 18 to 34-year-olds at 27%, 18% of 35 to 54-year-olds, and 13% of 55 and older have listened to a podcast in the last week. And as we saw with the monthly data, that's actually a little bit ahead of the United States data. In the United States, weekly podcast listening is 17%, and again, with Canada, it's 19%. We asked people who listen to podcasts weekly, that 19% of Canadians 18 plus, how many podcasts did they listen to in the last week? And that number here is very similar to what it had been in the United States for several years until this year, and that's 5. We saw about 5 podcasts listened to per week in the United States data for several years, and that's what we see here in Canada, 5. This year in the United States, however, for those of you that watched the Infinite Dial webinar from the US or are familiar with that data, that number in the US is now 7. And I attribute at least some of that bump to the release of some daily podcasts, things like The Daily and Up First, and there's a number of other entrants in this space. And again, I think as we see more and more native and homegrown entrants in that space, the kind of topical, but possibly news-driven daily podcasts in the Canadian sphere, that we will see that number rise for Canada as well. We asked people, what's the device you use most often to listen to podcasts? And I'll say a couple of things about this graph. First of all, number one, 40% of Canadians say they use a computer, a laptop or a desktop, most often to listen to podcasts, compared to 29% of the US. Again, I think that has an awful lot to do with the differences in mobile plans between the two countries. I think if the two countries had very similar economic structures in terms of mobile data, we would see similar numbers here. This is a graph that I continue to see misunderstood and misinterpreted. I mentioned this in the Infinite Dial US, mentioned it again. This graph does not say that 40% of podcasts in Canada are listened to on a laptop or desktop. It does not say that 29% of Americans or 29% of podcasts in America are listened to on a laptop or desktop. It merely says that 40% of Canadians say they most often use a computer to listen to podcasts. It's not a measure of the number of podcasts. And indeed, what we know is that people who listen to podcasts on mobile devices listen to more podcasts. So I've heard a couple of podcast hosts talk about this, saying, well, our podcast numbers show that it's more like 80 or 90% of our podcasts are delivered by mobile. That's probably true. This is not a measure of the number of podcasts. And in fact, that 80 or 90% of your podcasts could indeed be delivered to mobile to 68% of the people who listen to podcasts, while the other 29% who probably listen to fewer in America, or the 40% in Canada who probably listen to fewer, are simply saying they listen mostly on a computer. I wanted to take a moment about that because this is one that continues to be misunderstood when I hear people talk about it. We also asked people where they listened to podcasts most often. And in the United States, that number for at home is 49%. In Canada, it's 61%. And again, I think that's very closely tied to the fact that we see more people saying they listen most often on desktop and laptop computers. Probably not at work, as you can see. That number is quite similar to the US. But listening at home on a laptop or a desktop, a bit stronger in Canada than it is in the United States. In a car or truck lags the US significantly. I think as we see more in-dash entertainment and audio systems penetrate the Canadian market, we'll see that number go up. But right now, at home is the most significant location in terms of where people say they listen most often. And again, this does not say that 61% of podcasts are consumed at home. It says 61% of podcast listeners say they listen to podcasts most often at home. Just as we saw in the United States, most people say they listen to most of their podcast. Think about the audio podcast episodes you listen to. Do you typically listen to the entire episode? 47% agree with that. Or most of the podcast, 35% agree with that. So what we see here is clearly more than 80% of people who listen to podcasts say they listen to at least most of the podcast. Compare that to the United States. More Canadians say they listen to the entire podcast episode. So you're very polite. Thank you, Canada. 37% of Americans say that. 35% say they listen to most of the podcast episode compared to 44% of America. But otherwise, the people who say they listen to less than half, very similar between the two countries. And we also ask people if they ever increase the speed of their podcasts in order to listen to them faster. 9% of Canadian podcast listeners say that they do that. And if we compare that to the United States, it's twice as high in the United States. So again, I'm not sure what's driving that. I'd love to hear from some of my Canadian friends and folks listening to this webinar why you think that might be. But right now, Canadians are far less likely to listen to a podcast at a faster speed. Speaking of podcasts, this is the first announcement of this, and it's coming very, very soon for people who are just addicted to these webinars. I'm talking to you, Western Media Group in Vancouver. Podcast Consumer 2018 will be coming out April 19th. That's just 2 weeks from tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. And that's going to be a much fuller look at podcasting in the United States. I know we've released some of the top level data from Infinite Dial a few weeks ago, but Edison and Triton are once again going to bring you the next edition of the Podcast Consumer 2018. Going to have a much deeper look at things like demographics and consumption habits and crosstabs with some of the other behaviors that we've talked about here. So I'll be presenting that on a live free webinar on Thursday, April 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern. There's already, I believe, a save the date post up on our website at edisonresearch.com. We'll be promoting it and emailing it coming up. But if you are interested in a deeper look at podcasting, that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. And so with that, I want to thank all of my colleagues at Edison and our great friends at Triton Digital for bringing you the inaugural Infinite Dial Canada. Very pleased to be able to bring this to our friends north of the border to join your partners at the Infinite Dial United States and the soon-to-be-released Infinite Dial Australia, and what we hope will be a look at Canadian digital media habits for many, many years to come. I'm Tom Webster, Senior Vice President at Edison Research. I'm going to sign off now. I'll be taking questions at the Infinite Dial hashtag and also on Twitter. You can use that hashtag on Twitter. You can tweet me at Webby2001. And on behalf of all of us at both Edison and Triton, thanks so much for listening.